I'd like to talk a bit about chapter 17 from your Give Me Freedom book. And this is the chapter dealing with 1890 to 1900. Now, if the period from, say, 1870 to about 1890 was the Gilded Age, or let's say 1870, 1875 to about 1890 was the Gilded Age, then really the period of 1890 to 1900 is the time when the gold starts to wear off a little bit. It gets a little bit threadbare, and a lot of problems get exposed. A couple of significant things happen in the 1890s. First of all, the 1890s are a time when, some of the economic problems that I talked about, with farming, really get bad, and the populist movement really picks up. Also, what we see too is that during the 1890s, there's also a major economic downturn. It's a major depression. It's probably as bad as the Great Depression, but in the 1890s, you don't have the technology to really record the suffering of people, and so it's not as well known as the Great Depression. Now, we're going to talk about the Great Depression in a few weeks, and I'm going to assign you all a lot of video to watch about the Great Depression. And you all will see what I mean about the fact that the Great Depression is at a point in time when we have the technology to record things much better, so we know that history better than we do the earlier period. Now, also, I'd like to say, too, that you all are going to be assigned a number of videos from YouTube this week dealing with material from Chapter 17. You're going to get a video on populism. You're going to get a video on Teddy Roosevelt. You all are going to get a video on the Spanish-American War. And so those are some things that you all will look forward to. I'll assign those videos probably Tuesday morning, later on Tuesday morning. I mean, it's almost midnight now. But anyway, let's get into some of the major things about the chapter. Now, as I said before, the populist movement really kicks off during this time. And we see that it develops in Texas. Originally, it's called the Farmers Alliance. It develops in Texas. And it eventually, spreads throughout the West. As the book mentions, it's not just popular among farmers. It's also popular, like in places like Montana or Colorado. It gets popular among miners, too. And it also gets popular in the South. As I said before, what's happening as you get into the 1890s is that farming becomes much more commercial. Farmers are no longer being subsistence farmers. They're very much tied into commercial markets. Farmers have to get loans in order to run their crops, which we see happening in farming to this day. And because of this, it becomes harder to make a profit. They have to pay back this money, and they're much more dependent on money, at the end of the 19th century than they were at the beginning. And of course, what the populists saw as more than anything else was that they saw railroads as holding them back, and they also saw banks holding them back. And so a number of proposals come up to eventually try to address these issues. Now, the populist movement had its origins in Texas, which, Texas is a big state. Texas was part of the Confederacy, but Texas also, is so big that parts of Texas are more like the Great Plains. Other parts of Texas are, are just simply, the West, because, Texas is really big, and it encompasses a number of geographic divisions. But what's significant about the populist movement is that it's very much a working class movement. But in the West and in the Great Plains, working class pretty much means white people. In the South, however, we see that the populist movement becomes a movement that pushes integration. And this is significant or not so much integration, but it pushes black participation in politics. Let me rephrase that. Not integration, but it pushes black participation in populism. In particular, the leader of the populist movement in the South is a fellow in Georgia by the name of Tom Watson. You all can look him up if you want. And Watson, during his populist years, very much wants, his message is very much an economic message. And he very much wants black farmers as well as white farmers to vote. And he wants them to break the power of big money in the South. Now, this is very significant because, as your book mentions, the South at this time really consolidates the post-Reconstruction system. And what we see is the development of what becomes known as Jim Crow, or the system of segregation. And eventually this is codified in law in 1896 when you have, oh my goodness, I'm drawing a blank right now. Plessy versus Ferguson. I don't know how I forget that. Been teaching history forever. When you have Plessy versus Ferguson, which says that it's okay for states or cities to have separate but equal facilities. This codifies segregation. Now, the interesting thing about Plessy versus Ferguson is that Homer Plessy was a very, very fair-skinned man of color in New Orleans. Matter of fact, if you look at pictures of him, if y'all want to do a search for Homer Plessy, go do it. Homer Plessy had to tell people that he was a black man in order to make a legal statement. And he goes to the Supreme Court and he loses. And interestingly enough, in the 1920s, he actually, goes in the census as a white man because, like I said, he looks so white. Unless somebody kept track of Supreme Court documents, they wouldn't know. But the thing about it is that populism really tries to go against segregation and tries to unite black and white farmers. But populism has its greatest success probably in the 1896 election. In the 1896 election, in 1892, you have the populists, they enter their own candidate. Now, the populist movement doesn't do so well, but by 1896, the Democratic Party absorbs the populist message, and William Jennings Bryan from Nebraska becomes the candidate for the Democrats, with a populist philosophy. And one of the recommendations that they have is what's known as free silver. In other words, to use silver as the basis of the monetary system instead of gold. Basically the idea is that with inflation, farmers could pay back their loans and not be in the hole. And this would, give them a better chance at life. Now, the bottom line is that the populist movement ends up failing. But what we see is that the populist movement, pretty much peters out after 1896. But within 15 years, within 10 to 20 years, a lot of ideas of the populist movement would end up being adopted in the earlier 20th century in what becomes known as the progressive movement. Now, the interesting thing about the populist movement is that the populist movement ends up not succeeding. And it really kind of sets a pattern for a modern political life. In that third party movements in America, the last time you really have a successful third party is when the Republican Party comes into existence and President Lincoln gets elected. And, America has not had a successful third party movement since that time. What tends to happen is that third parties come along, social movements come along, and major parties end up adopting the ideas of third parties. And then they implement them. And so what happens with the Populist Party, very much sets the template for American history in the 20th century and really going into the 21st century. I mean, as far as I can see right now, we're still very much in the two-party system of the Democrats and Republicans. Even though a lot of people are not happy with that system, we've yet to really come up with a replacement for it. And so that dynamic of, the two parties really having a strong hold on the political system, and that third parties, come up with ideas that the major parties end up absorbing. This is something that we see starting with the populist movement 130 years ago. Now, as I said before, segregation was established in the South. And, although segregation was most significant in the South, it really was something that picked up all throughout the country. I mean, if you look here in Southern Illinois, places like Alton, places like Edwardsville, Belleville, East St. Louis, the schools all segregated in the 1890s, around about the same time you had Plessy versus Ferguson. And so segregation picks up all over the country, which is interesting because, one of the interesting things about slavery is that you don't really have segregation during slavery. I mean, obviously slaves are not equal, they're not free, but you don't have a lot of restrictions on black movement. However, once you get into the Jim Crow era, you do have restrictions on black movement. I mean, there are whole states where black people cannot get a hotel room. I mean, even something as simple as getting a sandwich in a lot of places becomes impossible. I'm at an age, I'm 60 years old, and, I don't really remember segregation, but I know for a fact as a kid, growing up in the Florida Panhandle, and traveling, in Alabama quite often, a number of other places, my family, we had to take little porta potties for kids because, you simply could not use bathrooms. And if an area did not have a black bathroom, you could not assume you could use a white bathroom. My mother used to tell me how, she wouldn't drive me by McDonald's because she didn't want to have to deal with the fact that I couldn't eat there. This is like when I was a little kid in Florida, up until we left there when I was 4 years old. And so therefore, like I say, I'm old enough to have lived through it, but I need to probably be about 5 or 10 years older to have better memories. And so really, it's interesting, in 20 years, there are going to be very few people, even 10 to 15 years, there are going to be very few people who actually remember segregation. And so, these things have a way of passing. They're going to seem like they were much further back than they were because the living memory is going to die. But the thing to note is that, black people didn't take to sitting down. As opportunities were reduced in the South, there were attempts to move out of the South and do better. In particular, you had what were known as the exodusters, people who moved to Kansas, Black African Americans who moved to Kansas in order to have more freedom. And you still do have a few of these towns in Kansas, like, Nicodemus, Kansas. I remember driving through Kansas about 3 years ago. And, I remember I saw the sign, for Nicodemus, mentioning that it was that it is an exoduster town. And, for those of y'all who are history majors and interested in history, we have a professor in the department, Dr. Brian Jack, who specializes in that era. And so if you ever want to learn more about it, take his classes, talk to him. He can tell you a lot about that. Anyway, now, what I want you all to think about during this time is that, as I said, this was an interesting time in America. One of the things I mentioned, one of the films I was going to show you is the film on the Spanish-American War. And America in the 1890s is really starting to make the transition into a world power. Throughout the 19th century, the great focus of America was on expansion to the West. But really, as I mentioned, with the Battle of Wounded Knee in 1890, the American frontier really had disappeared. There were no places in America where you did not have significant white settlement. And so by 1890, the frontier is really disappearing. The Indian Wars are gone. Now, all the territories aren't yet states. I mean, places like Arizona wouldn't be a state until 1912. Oklahoma would not be a state until the 1900s. But most of these states, most of these places were becoming states by this time. And what we also see is that America is really starting to be a significant world power. Because America is industrializing, during the period, from the 1880s into the early 1900s, this is the period known as the Second Industrial Revolution. As we saw in the earlier chapters, we see the development of steel. We see the development of modern chemical industries. As you all remember with the film about Rockefeller, we see the development of the oil industry. And by the end of the 19th century, with the development of internal combustion engine technology, you begin to see the automobile industry developing in the United States. And this becomes and once this happens, of course, petroleum becomes a really extremely important product. Once you begin to have trucks and cars and motorcycles, that sort of thing, tractors, petroleum becomes even more expensive, more important. Now, the other thing, too, is that with this increase in technology and with this increasing economic power of the United States, we see that the United States also begins to assert itself in world politics. America begins to develop a navy. They develop modern naval ships, steamships. They develop ironclad ships. The ironclad ships first are being developed during the Civil War, and they continue to develop this technology. And what we see is that America expands into Hawaii. By the 1880s, America has gotten control of Hawaii. Hawaii was an independent country with native Queen Liliuokalani, who was the queen there when the Americans took over. America took that, and really significantly, by 1898, America goes to war with Spain and has the Spanish-American War. And this is really significant because America had always been interested in certain Spanish territories. In particular, America had been interested in Cuba. During the antebellum period, during the period of slavery, a lot of Southerners wanted to make Cuba an American state. Cuba is a big island. It's 800 miles long. It's the biggest island in the Caribbean by far. And it was an island that it had always had slavery, but slavery in Cuba really began to expand after Haiti got its independence because a number of Haitian slave owners, became refugees. They moved to Cuba. They were able to force some of the slaves to come with them, and they really began to develop slave-based plantations in Cuba. And in particular, we see the development of sugar plantations, and also tobacco becomes a major crop in Cuba, which is, not unlike, sugar, which was a major crop in Louisiana, and tobacco, which was a major crop in places like the Carolinas, North Carolina in particular, but also South Carolina, Virginia, Kentucky, East Tennessee in particular. These were areas where tobacco was a major crop. Maryland, too. And so a lot of Southerners had always had their eyes on Cuba. Cuba, however, never becomes an American state. But what we see is that by the 1890s, there's a fight for independence in Cuba. And this gets a lot of attention in American media. And eventually, Americans really begin to side with the Cubans who were fighting for independence. And what we see, and you all see this more in the film that I show you, is that eventually have an incident where an American ship is visiting Havana. It explodes. The Americans accuse the Spanish of doing it. And this results in the Spanish-American War, which is a very short war. And the Spanish-American War is very much kind of a colonial era war. Even though Spain was a European power, it was a weak European power, and America was a Western power that was on the rise. And the Americans end up taking Spain's empire. They take Cuba. Now, America lets Cuba get its independence, but certain territories, like Puerto Rico, were taken over through war. And, really, Puerto Rico is still a colony to this day. I mean, Puerto Ricans are American citizens, but Puerto Ricans, as long as they're in Puerto Rico, can't vote for president. Now, Puerto Rican can get on a plane and go to any state and become a resident and then vote in U.S. elections. But as long as they're in Puerto Rico, they can't do that. And really, this is because Puerto Rico is still a territory. I mean, when Puerto Rico was first taken over, it's over 20 years before Puerto Ricans become citizens. And so, like I said, that's some of the history of why, Puerto Rico still has this peculiar status, because it was taken over as a result of war. America also takes Guam, which is a Spanish possession. And, Guam, doesn't get as much attention because it's way out in the Pacific, a long ways from us. But it's still kind of held in the colonial state. Now, the major area that America took, but eventually had to let go of, was the Philippines. Philippines were a major island chain off the coast of Asia. And really, strategically, they're very important because the Philippines, they are on the eastern edge of the South China Sea. And so once America gets control of the Philippines, this allows the American Navy to have a really strategic position in Asia, a position in which they can, in which America can really make sure that its interests are being served. And one manifestation of this happens in 1900, for instance. The book doesn't really mention this, but in 1900 you have the Boxer Rebellion, where the Queen, the Empress, the Dowager, she's the Empress who looks over the young emperor. She leads a movement to fight against Europeans and Japanese who are controlling China. And that's known as the Boxer Rebellion. And the American Navy and Marine Corps are one of the major Western groups that, suppressed the Boxer Rebellion. And America is able to quickly jump into the situation in 1900 because they have naval bases, in particular Subic Bay, in which they acquire, by way of the Spanish-American War. Now, eventually, America lets the Philippines go after World War II, but the Filipinos were never happy with this. I mean, if you all read your book, Voices of Freedom, there are some articles in the chapter with chapter 17 about the Filipinos, in particular a piece by Emilio Aguinaldo, who's the leader of the Filipino independence movement, who talk about how the Philippines should be independent. And so really this is a significant transitional period. Now, you have a number of people, like particularly Teddy Roosevelt. He comes to the front during this period. Now, you ought to see a film about him. You ought to see more about him in the film. But this is a really important era in American history. I didn't talk so much about Depression in this lecture. Y'all can see more about that in your book. But this was a major transitional era into the 20th century, and really begins to lay the foundation for America as a major world power, and really begins to lay the foundation for reform and for the labor movement to really improve the position of working people, which is something we're going to talk about more in later chapters. Anyway, that's it for today. I hope you all enjoy this lecture, and I hope Labor Day was good for you, and I hope this week is good for you too. Take care.